So welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay and to a custom scenario actually, and this one was made by Vision, who is someone who is very much a regular on the Discord, and I do love it when people make maps like this because this is a very interesting looking map here from the outset, and there's a lot of different aspects to it which I'm looking forward to seeing how they play out. For example, over here we have obviously a settlement which is currently held by the Misty Mountains, and the Misty Mountains are going to be the red team today. The blue team are going to be the Easterlings of Rune, who we will get onto in just a moment, but obviously just have a little look at the map first because I do like to have a look through a map when it's one that's been freshly created. So obviously here we have a fairly basic settlement here in the back obviously, so this is obviously going to be the Misty Mountains centre point to their defence. We have some very wide open spaces over here as well, which is obviously going to play right into the hands of the more mobile elements of both the Runic and the Misty Mountains armies, be that trolls, wargs, or obviously the heavy cavalry and chariots of Rune. So this is going to be where this engagement takes place. But even out here there are still sort of terrain features and little villages and houses which both sides will have to take into account. And then up here, finally, there is also going to be a sort of more mountainous region out here on the side of the map. That Misty Mountains army is incredibly tightly packed together, but yeah, there's a lot of potential here in this battle. I'm actually very much looking forward to it. 27,000 frames is not overly long. There are a few rules associated with this scenario, but mostly it just sort of pertains to what armies can move when. So obviously it is going to be sort of a battle which takes place in stages, and obviously they will become more apparent as the battle goes along. But we'll have a look at the blue team first of all, I think, considering that they are the ones which are on the attack. And we will start off with the player who sent me the replay, and that is going to be Aethad, and he is going to be playing as the first Runic army, who is nearest to the mountains here in the south of the map. Now obviously Rune, all of their, I feel as though one of the criticisms that comes Rune's way is the fact that they're maybe a little bit reliant on their armour-piercing units, which can certainly bite them against factions which don't pack on a lot of armour. Like the majority of the Elven factions tend to do very well against Rune in a melee engagement. You have to be a little bit more creative. I personally do feel as though Rune do have the options to deal with that. It's not easy by any means, but you can do it. It's not an impossible fight for you to win, even if the odds are tilted against you. But in this situation against the Misty Mountains, the only survivability that the Misty Mountains can really count on is what is provided by their armour. So Rune's infantry in this particular instance should do very well for itself. And we have some Gamprim here on the front line. Obviously halberds. Neither side have got access to any sort of pikeman, so the Gamprim don't have to worry about being outranged by pikes in a melee fight. They may have to go halberd to halberd with heavy goblin halberdiers or white Uruk fearmongers, but for the most part Rune can count on having a phalanx advantage in this particular matchup. And then obviously backing them up we have the Flagrim, a very classic combination for Rune, all of the golden boys out in force, and obviously the Flagrim with their maces and their axes, very much an armour-piercing infantry unit. And as a line infantry unit they are very, very solid. I mean, they aren't that much, they aren't that much cheaper really than stuff like the Castamir's Legion from Umbar, and they're around the same sort of price point as the Guardians of Khan Doom, but they do kind of live or die on their AP with regards to their usefulness. But as I said, in this matchup, provided they don't get charged down or get hit by crossbows or javelins or the like, they should perform very admirably. And then back in behind them, more golden boys even. We have some Narim as well, which overall they're not going to do quite as well in a skirmish fight as the Variag mercenaries because they do lack that shield, but they do still do a pretty hefty amount of damage. Obviously the Easterlings of Rune in general do have quite a lot of options when it comes to engaging the enemy at long range, and the Narim, they might not be as popular as they used to be in sort of way back in vanilla, but they will still do a very good job for you if you can get them into the right position to shoot. Let's have a look at, actually that's some elite units over there. Back here we have some Sanras. This is actually a very elite army from Aethad, I would say, so he is probably going to be moving through the mountains when his army is activated with a lot of aggression, because there's a lot of units here which are going to be doing very well on the front foot against the Misty Mountains, you would have to say. The Scion Rim, obviously not as damaging potentially as the Flagrim or the Gamprim in front of them, because they do lack AP and obviously they are spears, but they are very, very tanky indeed. The Scion Rim are very, very difficult to bring down over a long engagement, and obviously they have those spears, which means good mass, and obviously anti-cavalry as well. And then just in behind here we can see some Eastron crossbows as well, which do have the first level of armor. Actually no, they only get one level of armor upgrade, don't they? But yes, the armor upgrade is going to be theirs. Even with this, however, the Eastron crossbows are not terribly durable at range. I mean, this will mitigate some of the damage, but it is really like sticking a plaster on a gaping wound. It's still very much their main weakness. But obviously crossbows, if they get into the right position, very, very deadly indeed. Having a look over here at some of the more speciality troops that Rune have to offer, there are the Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen, which are one of the unit which, well, among the non-Elven factions, they are one of the units to have the highest defensive skill in the game. I believe they have a defensive skill of 24, which even most elves can't match actually, but obviously they are somewhat fragile in other ways, like they're not multiple HP, and obviously they have a relatively low unit count. If they can get into the right position, however, they can throw their sort of Nafatoon-like projectiles to do some nice damage, and then when they're committed to melee, obviously, you know, their skill will mean that they can cut units like heavy goblin infantry to ribbons. We have 2 units of the Balchor Sapphire Bladesman, which is honestly, you know, you don't get to see 2 units of these guys very often, with the blue wizards in and amongst them as well. They are one of the few units to have the throne trait, which is basically a sign that, you know, it's a very, very strong and elite javelin unit. I believe the Demons of the Desert and the Khazad-dûm Reclaimers are the only other ones that I can think of off the top of my head, maybe the Reforged Javelins as well. And the Reforged Javelins are a pretty decent sort of comparison to the Balchor Sapphire Bladesman overall. Very, very deadly javelins, and also pretty damn good when it comes time to muck in melee. Some Camel Shadow Guard, obviously some shock infantry that can hide, obviously very damaging off the charge AP, but perhaps a little bit lightly armoured, so they can be focused down from range. A single unit of Eastron Hunters just to give some more archer pressure, and then finally we have the General, who is going to be in the Dragon's Wrath Warlords, multiple HP Lancers, which will do a lot of damage if they can charge into those goblin infantry ranks, but also they need to steer well clear of the wargs, because the Misty Mountains wargs and trolls will have a field day against multiple HP Lancers in terms of getting cost efficiency off. Going through the rest of the runic armies, I would imagine we're going to see some of the same sort of units, so we won't need to spend quite as long on them. But we do have BMK Overlord of the Dark Cloud playing as this sort of more central runic army. He does have some Dragon's Wrath crossbows, which again, I've said in the past, they are frustrating to use a lot of the time because it can be a real nightmare to get them into a position where they actually comply with their orders to fire. But when they do, their sort of flechette flaming shotgun ammunition that they tend to have will do a lot of damage. It'll also affect morale quite badly, particularly of low tier units like goblins. And they're also pretty damn good in melee as well, but a very sort of finicky unit to try and use. He obviously has got a lot of gamma for him as well. He's got the standard Baltroth Tribesman, which obviously certainly not to the same level as the Sapphire Bladesman, but basic javelins can be very, very cost effective indeed, provided you can get them into the right position, just like the crossbows. He's got a lot more Eastron Hunters by the looks of things as well, in addition to some Inasrim. The Inasrim of course don't have shields, but they are still a heavy cataphract unit. They are basically lancers. Maybe, you know, the same sort of criticism can be levelled at the Inasrim that I've seen levelled at the Knights of the Silver Swan, in that they are not cheap and it's kind of difficult to use them efficiently. But we'll see if BMK is up to the task here. He also has some Dragon's Wrath Warlords, which is where his general is undoubtedly. And then we've got some Narim, obviously some Flagrim mixed in here as well. He's also got some... yeah, he does have some Eastron Warriors in here, which are essentially the Clansmen, but the dual-wielding variant, which are more durable in melee because of their higher defensive skill, but obviously their lack of a shield really hurts them over the long course against enemy archers. He's got some Eastron Clansmen with both levels of armour upgrades as well, so definitely a not quite as elite, but still a very strong army from BMK. And then finally, the final army sort of spread out a little bit more. We have Artorius of the Abyss, who is going to be playing as Rune. He too has got some Dragon's Wrath Warlords. He's got a catapult as well, so this is obviously going to be the army which is going to be tasked with tackling the settlement primarily. You know, how the battle goes out in the hills and on the open field may determine how aggressive Artorius is allowed to be, but we'll see. He's also got some Eastron Hunters out here, so again a very cheap but cheerful skirmish force. He's got some Sapphire Bladesmen too, some Shadow Bows, so that's the first unit of Runic Rangers that we've seen. It's possible that there was some hidden in BMK's army as well, but obviously body piercing can be so lethal whether you're on the attack or the defence. More Narim, more Flagrim back here. He's also got some more Flagrim. Gamperim, obviously Gamperim and Flagrim, the backbone of these runic armies, all three of them. He's also got some Scion Rim here, which obviously could be used to push through potentially, even though there are a lot of goblins, and then some more standard Baltroth Tribesmen here at the back. So we will now move on to the Misty Mountains forces, and I was sort of thinking of a scenario in which Rune and the Misty Mountains would be fighting, and I suppose this would come after the defeat of both Dale and Erebor in the event that Sauron won the War of the Ring, and now they're just sort of fighting over the scraps and sort of who will rule over the Rovanian. But we will start off with Vision, the scenario creator, and he is going to be playing as the Orcs of the Misty Mountains, of course. He has got the Bolg's Champions, which is not his general by the looks of things, so they'll be allowed to be used more aggressively. And obviously one thing that the Misty Mountains will certainly have in this matchup is the ability to engage cav to cav, because Wargs, obviously with their anti-cavalry bonus, are going to be very efficient, and particularly against the Lancers and Cataphracts of Rune. The Dragon Knights would really be the only unit that the Misty Mountains would have to be slightly concerned about, and potentially Horse Archers, but there are no Horse Archers. skirmishers and standard walks as well, so they'll probably be sallying out, trying to sort of interrupt the advance of Artorias, maybe going for the cavalry as well, we shall see. Obviously a lot of heavy goblin halberdiers as well, so they may not have pikes, but this is the sort of the next best thing. Some cheap halberds which can be used as a cheap and cheerful phalanx on the front line, and obviously there are choke points in this settlement, so the halberds will probably be the ones, and probably going to be supported by some stronger units like the heavy goblin spears, I would imagine. The drummers will obviously make it so that they won't rout quite so easily, very important for the cowardly goblins for the most part. The heavy goblin crossbows as well, obviously another very useful tool that the Misty Mountains has, that only Isengard has. The only other orc faction to have access to crossbows, and obviously the Misty Mountains. It's a very potent tool potentially in this sort of situation. There's a lot more halberds back here. There's also more crossbows. There's some heavy goblin archers back here as well, so some decent skirmish forces here from Vision. But he also, that will obviously hurt him in terms of the amount of infantry he's able to field. He does have a couple of units of fearmongers, but you don't see 2 units of these guys too often. I believe the plan is to move the fearmongers to Dol Guldur when they are added in 0.97. But for the time being, they are still here in the Misty Mountains army. Black Uruks of the mountains over here as well, so slightly more skill-based shock infantry. Some Goblin King's bodyguard as well, which is where his general is, obviously the classic place to put them. And then a couple more units of heavy Goblin archers, and that is pretty much going to be the entirety of his army. Moving on to the central Misty Mountains army, out here in the more open part of the map, we have King Ammar. He has got some heavy goblin archers right along the front here. He does have his stakes deployed, but it's unlikely that the runic cavalry is going to beeline right down through here. Otherwise there's a very high chance that they'll end up sandwiched between all sorts of wargs. Misty Mountains obviously do have a few units that can hide, so it's very possible that units like Mountain Orc Berserkers and Blackback Berserkers are units that we won't be able to see. There's a lot of heavy goblin halberds as we go right down the line here, so again they're going to be right here, presumably to try and ward off any aggressive cavalry play. We also have some heavy goblin infantry over here. Heavy goblin infantry is obviously very much going to be just used as fodder and a sort of tar pit in melee here, because they're not really going to make too much progress against really any runic infantry unit that's on the field today. Very much here just for mass and sort of backing up the halberds, which might be able to do more damage, in addition to the AP of the heavy goblin spears, definitely a very important part of the Misty Mountains roster. A couple of fearmongers as well, obviously we know how good they are. And then up here on the hill, another Azog is going to be in another Goblin King's bodyguard, some crossbows up on the hill. And then back here, a couple of units of King Ammar's mounted contingent, or at least fast moving contingent. We have some more Bolgs champions, and we have some Drake broodlings. The final army is in a giant blob up here on the hill. It is DF Peak. He's got some heavy goblin infantry. He's got a lot of trolls, actually, a lot of snow trolls. There's also some drummers in there as well. He's got several units of heavy goblin infantry, heavy goblin crossbows and halberds, some standard goblin archers. I would say that just looking at some of the units that are included in this composition, that he probably has the weakest of the goblin armies, but he does have a lot of trolls, which could do a lot of damage, even to Eothard's army, which is quite elite itself, and some Goblin King's bodyguard, which is of course going to be where Azog is hanging out. So again, without further ado, I think, with the compositions largely dealt with, let us begin. So again, this isn't the longest fight in the world, so I would imagine that things are going to get going relatively quickly here. You can see that Eothard is immediately starting to move forward, and I would imagine that he is simply going to advance into the hills and start to tackle the threat that is going to be DF Peak. I'd be interested to see where Artorias goes, and it looks as though he's not going to go directly for the settlement. Instead, he's going to shift his focus here to the middle. He's going to add his cavalry, presumably, to the forces of BMK Overlord here, and they're going to punch right down the middle and maybe go for King Ammar, because obviously the more fortified position of the settlement should probably be saved for last, because if only one runic army attacks the settlement, Vision is probably going to have very limited trouble. Well, not a lot of difficulty in holding it all on his own, even with Artorias' catapult and rangers, probably not going to be too much of a problem for him. You can see that over here there is going to be a rather large push into the hills by the looks of things. Eothard is obviously going to be leading the way over here, but also BMK is sending over his Dragon's Wrath Warlords and his Inas Rim to head into the hills over here. Now, interesting move. There are a lot of trolls over here. There are also wargs. Wargs are plenty. But perhaps they've identified that if they can sort of work their way through the Misty Mountains armies one by one as a combined force, that will be their best chance of victory, which is possible. We'll see how that goes, but obviously Rune could deny them doing that. We can see that already King Ammar is starting to move forward himself, and if he moves forward far enough, he may be able to engage the runic forces, and then they will find themselves caught between two Misty Mountains armies, potentially. And then if Vision also joins the fray, it could be that this battle turns around from Misty Mountains being the ones that hold the settlement and the more defensive ground, but they could sally forth be a little bit more aggressive against Rune here while they're still manoeuvring around. My cold is mostly gone, but it's still just clinging to life, just about. You can see here that Peak is going to be moving forward now, and he is going to be moving for the Dragon's Wrath Warlords. They need to get out of there relatively quickly. Not the fastest Lancers in the world, they certainly are a little bit more focused around their armour and survivability than something like the Black Serpents. But having said that, I mean, these wargs do need to be a little, they do need to be decisive here, because if they're not, that is a very bold engagement here from Aethad. The Dragon's Wrath Warlords are tanky, but they don't stand a chance in sustained fighting against the Bolg's champions. Now, the saving grace here may be the close proximity of the Halberds is going to force the Misty Mountains onto the defensive. You can see here that Peak is already starting to pull back, the Innis Rim being used very aggressively. Rune would probably not be being so bold if the Gamp Rim were not in such close proximity, because obviously the wargs will really not enjoy being in melee with a Halberdier unit. And that is why the Gamp Rim are leading the way. There's also some Eastron Hunters here if the crossbows get in position as well. If Rune keep up this sort of methodical advance forward, the pressure and the danger that the wargs represent to the runic cavalry may not materialise over the course of this battle. We shall see. I'm actually a little bit surprised as well. You can see here that King Ammar is going to be advancing into the hills. I'm actually a little bit surprised that he's committing his full army to help Peak, because this is going to turn into a singular choke point fight, which I honestly think Rune have probably got the advantage in. I think that the Misty Mountains, what they really want to be doing is trying to use their wargs and their trolls, particularly the snow trolls, with how fast and mobile they are. If they turn it into a choke point fight, the crossbows and the javelins of Rune up on this portion of the map should favour Rune, I would say. So I'm actually a little bit surprised. I mean, you can see there that obviously the Dragon's Wrath Warlords charging in, but that was very foolhardy. That, I mean, they were going for the Snaga skirmishers, but those Dragon's Wrath Warlords, they got caught in melee then by wargs and by the snow trolls. I mean, they're cycling in and out here. BMK Overlord charging in, but he decides to he thinks better of that with all the javelins and also the Bolg champions. But like I was saying, I was surprised that King Ammar didn't actually advance down through here and start trying to put pressure on the side, because then that would also allow Vision, I think, to start putting pressure on Rune from behind, and pulling Rune out into the open field with all of the wargs available to the Misty Mountains may have been the way to go about things. We shall see. There is obviously a little plinth up here which can be used to sequester away a few skirmisher units, and obviously heavy goblin crossbows in this position is going to be very, very deadly. And this might be a bit of a saving grace for this defensive position. If Rune come forward in force, they're going to have to survive a hailstorm of crossbow bolts and archer fire. The crossbows in particular will be very, very deadly indeed. The Eastron clansmen are moving forward, but Peak has set up his front line. Again, just a singular choke point seems to be where the armies are sort of gathering up here in the hills in the south of the map. We'll see who gets the better of this engagement. You can see here that the Goblin Archers immediately starting to open up on the Gamp Rim. A little bit more decisive action, I think, is going to be required on the part of Rune here. They are the ones which were very eager to rush up into these hills. The Misty Mountains have sort of formed ranks to block them. So what happens now, I think, the ball is in Rune's court. You can see here the Dragon's Wrath Warlords are going around, so it could be Rune could sort of take the initiative here. And it does look as though Artorias, and, well, yeah, just Artorias' army is actually going to be the one which goes into the open field. But unfortunately for him, if he's quick, he could start sort of hammer and anviling all of this position that King Ammar and Peak has set up. But unfortunately for him, Vision is also sort of forming ranks on the other side of that river over there, and he could come to the aid, and then it could envelop Artorias' army. So again, I think it's whoever is the boldest, whoever takes the initiative first, could be the ones to claim the advantage in this fight. Meanwhile, this big blob of Eastron clansmen, there were no Gamp Rim over in this sector, so again, that's good awareness there from King Ammar. He noticed that there were no halberdiers guarding these clansmen, so he got a quick, cheeky charge off into this runic infantry, obviously killing off a good number of them. And this is a bit of a broken advance here. This singular unit of Gamp Rim is coming forward, but they're going to need more support than this. You can see here that the Goblin Archers and the Heavy Goblin Crossmen are going to be firing down into them as well, and now the Misty Mountains army is sort of pulling forward. They're going to be the ones to try and get Rune onto the wrong side of the Crescent Moon, which they're going to be successful in. Again, just pushing that one unit of Gamp Rim just a little bit too far ahead of the rest of the main army. There's some Eastron warriors coming in here as well, which will be fodder to the archers. Even the Goblin Archers should be able to do a decent amount of damage to them, even with the armour upgrade. There's also some Scion Rim moving in. Rune need to get their own archers in position, which they have done. But I think that this fight now is actually suiting the Misty Mountains a little bit more. Rune are bottled up. and they're not really able to get into a position where they can support this infantry too easily, whereas up there, obviously, those crossbows, they may have to arc their shots down a little bit, but this is too good of a target to pass up. Rune need to make something happen at this point, and actually, we can see that Artorias may very well be able to do that, as he is pushing very far down this this position. Vision is also not coming out. It might be part of the rules as well that I've forgotten, that Vision may not be allowed to leave the surroundings of the settlement, in which case Artorias should immediately work to get his army in to surround this position, because the longer that Eothad and BMK have to sort of withstand this hideous amount of range pressure that they're under, the worse it's going to be for Rune as a whole. Still the heavy goblins holding the front line resolutely, which you don't hear all that often. There's a lot of companies of heavy goblin halberdiers and spears in loose formation ready to be committed when the line looks like it's starting to fall apart as well. There are Baltroth tribesmen in position. There are Narim that have gotten a little closer. Baltroth tribesmen seem to be sort of trying to attack more exposed sections of the line. Aha. And this is what I'm interested to see. So Artorias is going to be advancing into the hills. The Misty Mountains have bottled themselves up at this point. We'll see whether King Ammar was correct in sort of combining his might with Peak's, because they are now going to have to face foes on two sides, with Artorias' runic army getting ready to attack them in the rear. There are wargs over here, of course, which the wargs are going to be more useful over here before Artorias sets up. The wargs and the drakes could start to try and make life a little bit more difficult for Rune as they advance into the hills. We shall see. And overall, the quality advantage in terms of the infantry is still very much in Rune's favour up here. Not only do they have three armies, but Eothad's army in particular looked packed with a lot of Rune's finest units. The only thing they were missing really was the Carmel's Chosen. Everything else they certainly had available to them. We can see more Scion Rim moving forward, more Gamp Rim moving forward. And as time goes on, a lot of you can see here that the Goblins are already shaken. I think the Drummers need to get maybe a little bit closer, because the Goblin line is starting to look a little bit thin on the ground here. Goblin archers at this point, are they out of ammunition already? They might be being committed forward. Heavy Goblin halberds now being committed forwards to the front line. A lot more companies. The Snow Trolls are also coming in. So the Snow Trolls should be able to do a decent amount of damage, but they are going to need some more support, I think, and they are going to get it from the Heavy Goblin halberds. So the Snow Trolls colliding with the runic line. Now this should do a decent amount of damage, but you know, in a very grindy fight like this, the Trolls will still fall away relatively quickly. Even slightly tankier Trolls like Snow Trolls. You know, there's a lot of AP on the front line. I mean, the Scion Rim won't do a lot of damage, but they're also fairly tanky themselves. And you can see that Rune can afford to just send forward more quality units like the Flag Rim to keep trying to batter down this Misty Mountains position. And you can see actually that the Heavy Goblin halberds are not rushing in to help their Snow Troll brethren, and that could end up being a terrible mistake. Meanwhile, you can see over here that the Bulk Champions managing to catch out a unit of the Loka Rim, but the rest of the Runic army is on the way. So the resources of the Misty Mountains are stretched very thin, and it's fair to say that the Misty Mountains will lose this fight up in the hills. But how much damage can they do to all the Runic armies, and can they give the advantage then to Vision in the late game to be victorious? You can see here the Scion Rim are moving forwards. There's a lot of arrow fire coming in as well from the Misty Mountains in their defensive positions, but the Scion Rim will be all too happy to see those arrows coming their way. Good shields, solid armour as well. And this Misty Mountains line is not yet ready. There are some Mountain Orc Berserkers, there are also some Blackback Berserkers, but you can see here Artorias able to get some Spearmen in behind. Now they're not going to be able to make it all the way to the archers if that is what Artorias is intending, but they are at least causing this line to look like a real mess, which the Misty Mountains can't really afford at this point. The Flag Rim, meanwhile, taking a charge from the Drake Brooklings. Actually, I think it's about time we turned it down to half speed. All of the wargs over here do have a bit of an opening to do a fairly hefty amount of damage actually to Artorias' line, so this is good moves here from both King Ammar and from Peak. All of the wargs have got a nice opening here. There's not a huge amount that they can do to stop this, to be honest with you. There are some Sapphire Blazemen, but they are instead using their ammunition on the infantry block, which Rune already has a fairly hefty advantage in. They need to do something about these wargs and these drakes, because this is a real danger. I mean, a lot of Artorias' army could be munched up by all of these dangerous units. There's 2 units of Bulk Champions up here, as well as the Drake Broodlings. That is a lot of shock value. Meanwhile, more and more resources are having to be siphoned off to deal with Artorias' advance, and this obviously means that there are fewer and fewer reinforcements to actually help on this front line to deal with Eothad and BMK Overlord's advance. Rune continuing to push forwards. And yeah, this front line now, it's obviously there's Goblin archers that are being sort of rallied forward to try and hold the line. Never a good sign, especially when they're having to face off against the quality core that Rune have to offer. The heavy Goblin halberds taking some nice skirmish fire as well from Rune, so that's good. They're picking on the targets which are easier to hit and easier to damage. There's more heavy Goblin infantry now moving in. We may as well go up to 1 speed actually, and the heavy Goblin infantry trying to sort of plug this gap which is appearing. There are still those crossbows which are in a very, very good position. I mean, those crossbows are going to be doing a lot of damage to Rune. Rune will be victorious, but again, like I said, you know, will Rune take enough, well, manage to mitigate enough of this damage so that they are still in a position to go forth and crush Vision after all this is said and done. The Warp Skirmishers charging into those Baltroth Tridents, doing a decent amount of damage as well, considering they are Jav Cav. But at this point you can see that now Artorias is starting to get a decent defensive screen up. He's starting to get these Loke Gamperim into position, and obviously that is going to, you know, the Volks champions need to steer well clear of the Gamperim. They also can't afford to just hang around in front of the Baltroth Tribesmen. You can see another charge coming in there from Peak, doing yet more damage to the Sapphire Bladesmen. The Eastron Hunters won't be able to do as much damage as the Bladesmen, but it's still a problem. Rune's still taking charges, and they are still being pulled apart. I mean, this is good micro here from both King Ammar and Peak. They are sort of pulling those halberds out of position and going after the squishier targets. That wasn't a very good charge, though, from the Drake Broodlings. You know, they should really be flattening a unit of Eastron Hunters with impunity, but that didn't really come to pass there. Meanwhile, this front line, obviously, when that Scion Rim got in and around the front line, it was always going to be alarm bells starting to ring for the Misty Mountains defensive position, and the Golden Legion continuing to march forward. Here comes the heavy Goblin halberds as well, moving forward to try and patch up this line, but again, it's really just a matter of trying to kill off as much as they can. I mean, this unit of Scion Rim has probably chased the enemy too far at this point, because they are being engaged by Fearmongers, which should be able to deal with Scion Rim relatively easily when they're in formation. Meanwhile, ooh, they're starting to buckle this formation here. The Cave Troll Drummers are going to try and stop the cavalry, but the gap appeared. As soon as the gap appeared, BMK Overlord got his Inas Rim in behind the enemy lines. He's going to go for the crossbows, I think, but he's going to charge right into the front of the White Uruk Fearmongers, which leads us to say you can see how quickly the Fearmongers are going to cut down a unit like the Inas Rim. Again, good armour values, but that means very, very little to the White Uruk Fearmongers. The Trolls are also in here as well, so the Inas Rim, despite the fact that they are causing a bit of chaos, they may meet their doom here with all of these Trolls around and all of these Halberdiers. They're charging into the back of a formation which is comprised mainly of Halberds as well. There's some breaking going on there from the heavy Goblin Halberds. The Inas Rim live to fight another day. The Goblin King Bodyguard are being committed forwards now. The Misty Mountains are really just sort of trying to hold down the fort with whatever they have remaining, but now that they've got this Inas Rim in behind them, they need to commit something to try and stop them. Otherwise, this very strong unit of Blackback Berserkers is showing their back to a unit of Lancers, albeit that was a very underwhelming charge, and they need to get out of melee with the Blackback Berserkers as quickly as they possibly can. More and more Misty Mountains forces being committed forward. Let's go and see what's happening in the rear. You can see the Vision is now moving forward, so he is now, I suppose the time has elapsed, and he is moving forward. So we're not actually going to see the settlement or the open field. The way that this scenario has worked out, and the way that the Runic players in particular chose to sort of dictate this fight, was to move into the hills and settle it up here. Now that Vision is on the way, all may not be lost. Vision's cavalry is here as well. You can see here there are some White Uruk Fearmongers that have come around, and the White Uruk Fearmongers will beat the Gamperim 1-to-1. Here come the Drake Broodlings, although they've really just disrupted their own formation there. That was a foolish charge to try and take on. There's a lot of ranged support here from Artorias as well, so Artorias is now the one which is going to have to defend over on this flank, while keeping up the pressure over here to try and crush the two Runic players which bottled Misty Mountains players which bottled themselves up, which I feel as though could be what decides this match. I feel as though this is the sort of battle which Rune always would have preferred based on the compositions here. It's always tempting to try and sort of wall up behind a very defensive position, but if you don't have the army to sort of fight that battle against your opponents, it's not something you want to try and engage in. Looks like we've got some Cave Trolls on the way up now, ready to do some damage. The Sapphire Bladesmen are on the way over, which the Sapphire Bladesmen are not likely to take too many prisoners at range or in melee. And the Cave Trolls are not exactly the sturdiest of the Trolls, but they will at least be able to That's a lot of arrows, though. Yeah, and even trolls here are going to struggle to deal with all this. The shadow bows are there as well, so that's body piercing. The trolls are sort of trying to sort of march their way through, but look at that. Close range volley, and those trolls just got melted. Last samurai there. They did get into melee eventually with the shadow bows. But at what cost? Meanwhile, this Misty Mountains front line is actually still holding, and at this point victory, well, yeah, I'd say the balance of forces even is a little bit fairer. I mean, the blackbacks are in here, but still, the runic quality would, well, there's a lot of fearmongers as well. Artorias here is in danger actually of being overrun. If Vision's infantry gets here fairly soon, could be pretty grisly for them, but again, over here is where Rune are having quite a lot of success. Eothad's army was very elite, and with the backup of all of BMK's infantry as well. But still, the Misty Mountains do still have a front line here. I mean, it's on the verge of collapse. It's, you know, basically 2 ranks deep at this point. And there's a lot of angry Easterlings over here. Oof. And that is the catapult of Artorias, which was moved over here, which is definitely the right call. They're now going to be trying to bombard and perhaps break off what remains of the Misty Mountains defence over here. Forward come the wargs. Going to try and charge into the one area where there aren't any goblins anymore, but the problem with doing that is there's Scion Rim and Gamp Rim aplenty here on this front line, so the wargs are unlikely to actually achieve much by doing that. So I feel as though Vision would be much better off trying to sort of pile more pressure on Artorias, rather than sort of sending his wargs to die over here, because that is what's ultimately going to happen. I mean, his Bolg champions are on the front line now, in melee against Scion Rim and Gamp Rim, and they're just being poked down. I mean, it's possible they just want this front line to just survive just that little bit longer, give them a little bit more time to finish off Artorias. But I don't think I'd sacrifice my Bolg's champions for that. Let's see what Rune actually have left. I mean, they don't have many reserves left over here, to be fair, Rune. I mean, they still have some warlords, they've still got some elite infantry. I mean, they have committed a lot here. Vision's army is mostly fresh. We'll see if this has any impact, as Vision's army is now starting to engage Artorias as in melee, and this fight over here is most certainly turned around. The combination of Fearmongers and Blackback Berserkers over here has certainly done a lot of damage to the Easterlings in this section of the battlefield. Obviously they will pay for it eventually over there as Rune systematically obliterate that other goblin front line. But the good thing is they're going to be able to finish off Artorias' army just a little bit more quickly, and that might end up being the smart move. Warg skirmishes on the way here. We can see the Fearmongers getting into position. The Easteron Hunters, I think, are going after the Cave Troll Drummers, which in my opinion is not the right thing to do. The White Uruk Fearmongers is absolutely the unit they should be going for, because they're so good in melee. Obviously the lack of a shield as well, whereas the Cave Troll Drummers, they still have a fair few HP. Going to be able to withstand that sort of pressure relatively easily. Meanwhile, the Black Uruks, the Mountains, finishing off what remains of a unit over here. There's still this runic firing squad over here, but at this point their front line over here has collapsed, so the infantry is gone, and that is ultimately going to be curtains for Rune over here. All of their skirmishers are now open to attack. The wargs are going to be coming in, so yeah, Artorias has fallen to pieces, as has the Misty Mountains defence over here though, so basically at the same time on both sides, both teams can claim a victory. Been very costly over here for Rune. There's a lot of dead Easterlings on the floor there. Those crossbows were in an absolutely ideal position after all. Meanwhile, moving back over to here, you can see the heavy goblin archers are sort of marching into melee against the Carmel Shadow Guard, but they're broken and fighting to the death. I mean, the Fearmongers do cause fear, as you would expect. The Dragon's Wrath Warlords, meanwhile, getting caught in melee by the Blackback Berserkers. That is not what they would want. They need to roll out of there as quickly as possible. The Sapphire Bladesmen are in melee, and they are good in melee. They'll be able to beat Black Uruks, maybe not Blackback Berserkers though. And the fact that Vision has got pretty much, you know, when they engage with Artorias anyway, they were completely healthy. That might be enough to give the goblins the win in this battle here, because Artorias has been overrun.
Give the fool a cup and make sure he doesn't want for wine while we slaughter his army.
Well, that's pleasant at the very least. Rune giving Azog, one of the Azogs anyway, a plentiful wine. Not as if the Goblin generals care about their armies anyway. The well-being of their men. But there are the heavy Goblin halberds. They're broken, actually. A nice charge there from the Warlords. You can see the Eothard's Warlords are over here helping out Artorias, so the cavalry did close the gap quickly enough to start doing some damage to the Misty Mountains. So that's good from Eothard, sort of trying to get in there and help out what remains of Artorias. Here are the Warg Riders. Ooh. Need to be careful they don't get friendly fire there, because yeah, that is certainly the heavy Goblin Archers. Friendly fire on the Wargs is absolutely not what is required. The Eastron Hunters are obviously not up to much in melee, but at this point Artorias doesn't really have a choice. He just needs to commit everything, basically. Crossbows getting into position, so at this point what Vision needs to do is sort of form his army up and get ready for the Runic Assault, which is going to carry on down here. The Warg Skirmishers charging in. They're actually going to be catching up to the Dragon's Wrath Warlords, so they're going to try and charge past them. The Warg Skirmishers do still have that anti-cavalry bonus in melee, but not quite as deadly as the standard Wargs, needless to say, and they are dying en masse here. The Dragon's Wrath Warlords, this isn't a very cost-effective use of the Warlords, but I mean, they're not going to be getting slaughtered for nothing like they would be against the Volk's champions. Oh no, this is a rather interesting ploy. What is Vision doing now? Is he going to try and retreat back to the settlement? Based on the amount of time left, I doubt that he's going to make it all the way to the settlement, but he could try and sort of go back to the low ground and use this choke point to his advantage, but that would be surrendering the high ground to Rune and their skirmishers. Here you can see the Dragon's Wrath Warlords in the backfield running all over the heavy Goblin Archers, so again a good pick there from BMK Overlord, trying to disable the Misty Mountains ranged presence. But they are going to be chased off by the melee Warg Riders. Not seeing a lot of Volk's champions left anymore, so at the very least Artorias seems to have done a lot of damage in those regards, as the Goblins start to pour back into the lowlands. Here though, the Warg Skirmishers are going to charge right into the front of the Balchor Sapphire Bladesmen. Now they'll do limited damage, to be honest, the Warg Skirmishers in that sort of situation. The Balchor Sapphire Bladesmen in melee are going to butcher Warg Skirmishers. Again, they are very strong in melee. They've got the Narim giving them a bit of support in melee as well. A bit of a rearguard action, I think. This one unit of heavy Goblin Halberds is going to be trying to hold back the full might of the Runic Infantry, as the rest of Vision's army moves into the low ground. Interesting indeed. Meanwhile, here comes the infantry assault, and one unit of heavy Goblin Halberds not going to be able to hold back BMK and Eothard's armies for too long, you would imagine, especially if they push in with some mass. Again, Flagrim and Scionrim could buckle this formation, and then once the phalanx is taken away from the heavy Goblin Halberds, will get crushed by the AP of the Runic Infantry. Still a fair few units over here as well. A lot of them are fairly depleted, but there's still a good amount of runic numbers back here. They still have that catapult, which is relatively important. Some Shadow Guard, the Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen, some Scionrim. We haven't seen the Dragon's Wrath crossbowmen yet either. They may have already been used, but I kind of doubt it. Rune weren't really in a position to actually use them, and there they are. It's one of the reasons why I'm actually quite surprised here that Vision is sort of occupying the lower ground, because he will be giving the Dragon's Wrath crossbowmen a very nice shot into his army. If that's the ground he wants to defend, this sort of position in here, then those Dragon's Wrath crossbowmen, if the Misty Mountains don't have crossbows of their own to kill them off quickly, they could be in trouble. Meanwhile, he's also thrown this unit of halberdiers under the bus. They're going to do their best to hold the line, but definitely a rearguard action, dying for the cause in true Goblin fashion. Heavy Goblin Archers up on the hill, they're very depleted, but still doing their bit for the cause, doing a bit of damage. Those Warg Skirmishers running now with their tails between their legs as the Runic force closes in on them. And it is really only Vision that has an army left. I mean, as we see, King Amar's got like a single unit of archers. Perhaps a few units from Peak as well. What is this? Ah, Eastron Crossbowmen, finding a little gap here. Already making the high ground pay, which is why I'm actually quite surprised. I mean, I suppose that Vision felt that he couldn't cover this entire area, like this whole front line here, as well as this section here. So he had to retreat, because Rune were moving to envelop him. But to be forced off the high ground unceremoniously, that's rough. And the crossbows, the Eastron crossbows now have a very nice firing position, going after good targets as well. The White Uruk Fearmonger is exactly the sort of target you want to be going for One player admitted defeat, and I would imagine that that is peak. I think his army is the only one where there are no actual goblins left. Very good here from Eothad, getting his crossbows into the correct position. And we see here, just in time, the heavy goblin halberds broken and fighting to the death at the very least. But obviously they are going to get absolutely butchered now by the runic force, and this is going to allow the rest of the runic infantry to move forwards in support of the rest of their army that was flanking around over there. And yeah, I'm not surprised at all to see that the Misty Mountains are going to try and fall back even further. They can't afford to give Rune the superior ground to this extent and allow their archers and crossbows to start going to town on them. They need to get away from the hills at this point. The hills are lost. We make for Helm's Deep, or whatever this town is called. As the Nar Rim now getting into position, and again a very nice firing position, just like the crossbows on the other side, and they're going to be able to get a few good volleys off here. I would say that this fight is slightly getting away from the Misty Mountains at this point. I mean, we are just into the final 10,000 frames. Rune are 9% ahead. The Misty Mountains do still have some pretty nice tools. They do still have the Fearmongers, they do still have those halberds, they have the crossbows, but again, in order to make use of a lot of these tools, like the Fearmongers and the Blackbacks and the crossbows, they need a good defensive position. And I'm not sure whether they're going to be allowed to do that. I mean, once again, they're having to leave behind whole units as a rear guard to sort of make sure the rest of the army can escape. And these are relatively healthy units of heavy goblin halberds, which would be very useful in making some sort of last stand. And unfortunately for these halberds as well, Rune are under no obligation whatsoever to engage them in an honourable melee fight, and it looks as though the firing squad is being set up. A unit of Nar Rim, some Eastron crossbows are also moving in. And I think at this point the heavy goblin halberds are going to try and run, although they need to get out of phalanx formation, otherwise their sort of slow motion walk away is going to be a tragic one as they get shot in the back. Here come the Eastron crossbows. I mean, the Eastron crossbows in particular are going to be able to do grievous damage to a unit like heavy goblin halberds. And here we go. Yeah, and you can see here that this is exactly what this unit of heavy goblins did not want to have to endure, and around 40 of them immediately dying under a volley of arrows and bolts. And still the Misty Mountains are in kind of all over the place a little bit here. I mean, if Rune had more cavalry in this situation, it would be all over. Like, they'd be able to just overwhelm them on the retreat. But fortunately for the Misty Mountains, at the very least, Rune don't really have a comprehensive cavalry force left. They do still have some warlords, but certainly not enough to break the entire army, especially not with the Fearmongers and the halberds around. Artorius trying to get his catapult in position. Now the catapult will have a large range of operation here up on a hill with this high ground. I'm not sure whether they'll be able to actually hit something, but it will put more pressure on Misty Mountains to continue running back to the settlement. So I mean, phase 1 of the battle, or phase 1 and 2 depending on how you look at it, has gone in Rune's favour. They captured the southern hills. Now will they be able to capture the true goal and take the settlement? Here go the runic artillery volleys. Will they be able to hit something? Nope, very narrow misses though, surprisingly enough. And now you can see here the runic infantry starting to run down. I'd be very surprised if this unit of halberdiers made it. I mean, now the cavalry's on the way down, which, if they're already shaken and they take a charge from a unit of quality lancers, not going to go too well for them, needless to say. Still the Misty Mountains starting to pull back. I mean, they could try and hold this choke point across the river, but I feel as though they really need to try and hold the settlement, which, while you will need to cover more choke points, 3 in total, I feel as though the opportunity to get those crossbows up on the higher ground is simply too good to pass up. Like, they need to do something here, because if it comes down to just a pure brawl in melee at this point, I feel as though Rune have got all the answers. As the faction who started off with the intention of being the attackers, I'm sure, it's not really too much of a surprise to see Rune have got the slightly higher quality. And here we can see that the Dragon's Wrath Warlords are going about their grisly work, breaking off a unit of heavy goblin archers, so that's more of a skirmish presence gone. This unit of halberds did turn around, and they killed off one of the runic horsemen. I mean, all of the warlords are actually still alive, including Artorius's. They're all pretty depleted at this point in time, but they're all still alive. And there go the heavy goblin halberds. Obviously the goblins, when they're unsupported, break very, very easily. And that's going to be the end of that unit of halberdiers, which again, another unit which could have been very, very useful as Vision and King Ammar continue to try and sort of desperately retreat back to the settlement, a more defensive position for them. I'm not sure whether they're going to be able to make it. I mean, that runic cavalry is going to be barreling down on them. They might have to leave behind yet another unit as a rearguard action, which would basically leave 3 units that they've lost in their attempt to just retreat to the town. There are the heavy goblin archers as well. Forward come the Narim. You can see here that the runic cavalry just scouring these goblins from the field, ruthlessly charging them down. You gotta love the runic cavalry. The golden cav. The army in general obviously now moving forward. The catapult is also coming down. The runic army is relatively stretched and spread out. Oh, there's that sort of sprite glitch again. But they won't be too concerned. There is actually one Blackback Berserker over here. He's just sort of standing here staring at the river, contemplating his life, and then he's going to get skewered by several of these very angry men from the east. But yeah, I mean, here the heavy goblins once again. I mean, they're moving very slowly here, which is a bit of a problem. I mean, they're sort of trying to go through this terrain, which is understandable, but they're still taking losses on the retreat. It's been a costly retreat, this one. I think the Misty Mountains threw a lot of their manpower into that fight in the hills, which they in the end lost, and it's going to be a long way back for them here. It's not impossible, but I feel as though with all of these ways into the settlement, if Rune are aggressive and just move in with all of their power all at once, I don't think there's much that the goblins of the Misty Mountains are going to be able to do to stop them. Meanwhile, Eastron Hunters leading the way with the Dragon's Wrath Warlords behind them, the Scion Rim as well. Warlords just here on the periphery again. The mobility is very much in favour of Rune now, with all of their multiple HP Lancers still alive. Which, considering the fight took place in the more claustrophobic environment of the mountains, is not too surprising, to be honest with you. If it was on the more open field, I would have expected the Misty Mountains and their wargs to claim victory in terms of the mounted game. But as it was, Rune can count themselves fortunate that the wargs were forced to operate in very cramped conditions. Well, these heavy goblin spears, are they actually going to make it back? I don't think they are. They are going to get charged in the back. It wasn't the worst charge they could have taken, but it's a very depleted unit already. King Ammar, what little remains of his army being pestered. He does manage to kill off a Dragon's Wrath Warlord in return, but you know, at this point the runic cavalry is just going to be there to try and do things like that. I mean, the Misty Mountains at this point are going to be almost entirely reliant on the heavy goblin crossbows getting some good volleys off. They need to get up onto these walls, to be honest with you. They need to get up onto the high ground. There are a few resources over here which are going to be sort of committed to try and stopping the heavy goblin halberds. Probably going to try and plug this gap. But obviously there's that entry as well, which is probably going to be used by all of the Dragon's Wrath Warlords, I would imagine, to start putting pressure on the backfield. What the Misty Mountains could have done, potentially, I mean, I don't know if... Can you get up here? They could have tried to sort of cluster their defence around here, try and make the battlefield as small as possible. Or try and sort of form a Helm's Deep in the settlement itself, in the streets. Oh dear. And I'm glad that we just caught the tail end of that, because the Dragon's Wrath crossbowmen, without any of their own units in front of them, they are free to fire, and that was a huge amount of damage that just got done there to the goblin units in a single volley. We'll see if the Dragon's Wrath crossbowmen can keep that sort of pressure up. But as it is, I think that the goblins are still trying to cover too much ground. Again, I feel as though there are positions in the settlement that could have been, such as back here, they could have used to sort of cluster their army around. As it is, though, it's going to be a big ask for them to cover 2 large choke points while getting harassed by cavalry from a third. Credit to the goblins. They're still putting up a fight, still resisting the runic invasion. The Gamprim taking a lot of damage actually there from the heavy goblin crossbows. But Rune have got manpower to spare at this point, you would imagine. Stretched out though, the runic army. The Narim are firing in through this gap, however, and as much as the Gamprim are taking damage from the crossbows, the heavy goblin halberds are also taking damage from the runic skirmish line as well. And there is the runic catapult. They're going to try and do some damage to the archers which are up here on this raised ground. All of those hits, however, hitting the natural stone wall. This unit of heavy goblin spears, which was just out in front, is now being overwhelmed by the runic infantry. Just arrows and bolts flying back and forth. Dragon's Wrath Warlords loitering with intent in the backfield there. Oh, excuse me. Cold is not entirely gone yet. Yeah, but those heavy goblin spears obviously just sent out there, try and delay the runic force as much as possible, but at some point you have to turn around and start doing damage to Misty Mountains, and unfortunately, as much as they've managed to delay Rune with some of these sort of individual units that have stood in the way of their advance, ever since their loss up in the mountains, I don't think they've quite had an answer for the runic push. We've got over here more infantry coming around from the side, so yeah, Rune doing exactly the right thing here, spreading out. They've got the numbers advantage in terms of the infantry at this point. The Misty Mountains are not going to be able to hold every single one of these angles. More and more runic forces are starting to move forwards. That catapult is still just trying to bombard from afar. I mean, they may as well at this point. The catapult, I wouldn't imagine, is going to be too much of a key aspect to this fight. Narum are moving forward. There's still fearmongers. And now the runic infantry engaging with the heavy goblin halberds. Oh boy, I can only apologise for this this coughing which has suddenly come over me. Heavy goblin halberds repositioning themselves, but more runic forces are on the way. Yeah, I mean, at this point it's really just a last stand for the Misty Mountains. Can they at least die with honour, as the Easterlings have proven just too strong for them on this occasion. So heavy goblin archers sort of moving around. It's a mad defence at this point, as Rune are now pushing forward through the other choke point as well. Yeah, it's a relatively wide open settlement, at least on the outer reaches, with these natural walls and the 3 choke points which are fairly spaced out. If you were going to defend this settlement, you would definitely need more support from one of the other 2 goblin armies. As it was, however, this is definitely a scenario which I feel like could potentially work out in many different ways. There goes one of the Azogs. Yeah, this is definitely a scenario which I can see working out in many different ways, depending on what both sides decide to do. It's not as if one side holds all the cards. Rune decided to push 2 of their armies immediately up into the hills, and the Misty Mountains responded in kind. The Misty Mountains didn't have to do that. As I said, King Ammar could have pushed down through the middle in the more open ground, which would have been risky because Artorias was on the way as well. But again, it would have been an option. That's one of the Misty Mountains armies. I would imagine that is King Ammar's. His vision is now putting up his last stand. The Goblin King bodyguard and what's left of the Black Uruks being committed to this front line. Very grindy fight once again, but still the golden armour of the Easterling shining in the sun will be victorious today. White Uruk Fearmongers trying to kill off the Dragon's Wrath Warlords, finally sort of killing runic generals. There's the heavy goblin archers, which I think are trying to do the same thing, as Eothad's general charges into the heavy goblin archers, killing off yet more of them, although the runic general is in danger here. This is not an ideal place for him, especially not with the White Uruk Fearmongers on the way. Well, there he goes. I was going to say, all 3 of his remaining bodyguards there immediately died. He lasted a few milliseconds more than them at the very least. There's the Cave Troll drummers still banging away. Another runic force, however. Valtros Sapphire Blades and all, they still have ammunition as well. It's going to be Grizzly for this. Again, another Goblin Phalanx, which is going to be asked to hold the line, which really they are. It's way above their pay grade.
We have lost half our warriors.
Also the Nafatoon. Oh dear. There goes the Dragon's Wrath crossbows as well. The Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen will also be throwing their projectiles in, so all of the funky projectiles that Rune have to offer are being poured into this one unit of poor heavy goblin halberds. There you can see the Nafatoons being thrown in. It doesn't do a lot of damage, those Naft explosives, but it looks neat, and obviously it will grill the enemy. Very interesting unit, the Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen. I would be amazed if this unit of heavy goblin halberds did not break. Look at the damage they're taking. They actually went from wavering to shaken then when they started getting burnt alive. Real masochists. Now they're fighting to the death. So they're doomed. This front line is still holding, interestingly enough. Even fight here so far, but elsewhere things are not looking so good for the goblins. The cavalry is really one of the main issues, and the fact that there are still healthy units of Flag Grim running around, which a lot of the basic units will not be able to stand up for. I mean, The Fearmongers are a good unit, but there aren't enough of them at this point. The Baltros Sapphire Blazemen munching their way through those heavy Goblin Archers. There are the Flag Rib. Obviously they're going to very much enjoy facing heavy Goblin Archers. Victory is almost a certainty for them. A nice rear charge into the Black Uruks. The rest of the Runic army is pushing forward. The death throes of the Goblin resistance at this point. The Carmel Shadow Guard never even needed to be used. Well, actually that one was. That one's very depleted. The other one looks completely healthy though. The Cave Troll Drummers are still alive. Maybe trying to go for another general. Artorius, who is still alive. I mean, Baltros Sapphire Blazeman might not be the finest target for these Cave Troll Drummers to go after, but I guess at this point it doesn't really matter. Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen pulling out their dual scimitars now in melee to carve their way through some more goblins. Goblin Archers again being engaged by the Flag Rim. Routing from the Goblin Archers all over the place. Another charge coming in from the Dragon's Wrath Warlords of BMK Overlord. Flattening another unit of heavy Goblin Archers. And the Runic Cataphracts really twisting the knife here. Shadow Guard also doing their thing. Those wicked looking axes slash halberds. Those cave trolls are still there. Vision's version of Azog, I guess this is the true Azog, is still fighting on the front line as well, although perhaps not for long. He's being poked in the back by those warlords. Crossbows are routing as well. They're routing into the Flag Rim. That's unfortunate for them. I suppose this unit up here is probably going to be the last one left alive. Oh man, coughing fits all over the place, but another nice volley there from the Dragon's Wrath Crossmen. At least we've seen their ammunition be used. They used to have the same projectile as the Witches. They don't anymore, and their current projectile is not as effective as the Witches, if we're being honest, but it looks very cool. Azog, meanwhile, is just in here amongst a sea of hostile faces. Cataphracts, heavy spears, axemen. There's no way that he gets out of this alive. Or will he? I mean, he's routing into this mess. I mean, the match is going to end technically beforehand. I guess we'll say that he's been captured. Azog is now at the mercy of the Runic forces. We don't actually get to see the who was who in this sort of situation, but we can sort of make reasonable assumptions. Like, I would imagine Artorius is the one that got the least amount of kills for Rune, because he was the last one to engage, and he was also the one which bore the brunt of the Misty Mountains fury up in the hills. You know, these two, you know, BMK and Aethad can probably be fairly interchangeable with how they perform, because for the most part, both BMK and Aethad's armies moved pretty much as one. So very much a joint effort there from them. Similar story, honestly, with Peak and with King Ammar, but obviously they were surrounded and they had to wait for Vision to reinforce them, which ultimately was the difference maker. It was 3v2 for too long, and the two were not able to deal as much damage to Rune as they needed to ensure that the one remaining army in Vision was able to sort of mop them all up. And obviously Vision marched all the way out to the hills, did his best to sort of reinforce what was left, but then he realised that he couldn't hold that position and he had to retreat all the way back to the settlement, and he was taking damage all the way back as well. So very well played from both teams, but you know, Rune definitely deserved the victory here, obviously playing within the rules. Eastron Crossbows getting a good amount of damage here from Captain Boar, as it were. So yeah, I mean, the Crossbows getting into a good position. You would imagine they would get that many kills. Obviously the Narim doing very well for themselves as well. I think, yeah, this must be Aethad's army, based on the fact that there's Carmel Shadow Guard in here, one of which wasn't used at all really. The other one was savaged, but got a couple of kills. Eastron Hunters getting a lot of kills. Is the Eastron Hunters actually? No, it was the Eastron Crossbows that got the most amount of kills for him. Still, good performances across his entire army. I'd imagine then that this is probably, yeah, with the Dragon's Wrath Crossbowmen, this will be BMK Overlord. His Eastron Hunters doing very well. So again, these cheap archers, they were used from the outset, and they're going to be very good against basic goblins, because basic goblins and halberdiers in particular without their shields, prime targets for even the cheapest archers. And then finally we have Artorius, of course, the catapult. Not a huge factor in this battle in the end. I mean, it would have been more important for the attackers to use that well if they besieged the settlement right away. As it was, however, it had to move up into the hills, and by the time it was there, that fight had already been, you know, the tone for that fight had already largely been set. But yeah, just having a look through a couple of others, relatively even spread from all of his army. I mean, the Gamperim doing slightly better, Sionrim doing okay for themselves as well. So yeah, this was a good one, and I always like it when people make their own custom maps, because you get like more features. In this one, obviously, there's a lot of things to consider. The settlement fight, by the point they were fighting in the settlement, to be fair, runes held a significant advantage. But I like the fact that there's a more mountainous region, there's a more open region, there's the settlement itself, you know, the outer walls, and then the inner part of the settlement, which can also be used as choke points. A lot of features throughout the whole map, and I feel as though this is probably the sort of map which would probably perform better if it was a 4v4, personally, just because then we're probably likely to see a little bit more of the map used, particularly the middle of the map, whereas if it's a 3v3, I feel as though this fight would always either centre around the settlement or the mountains exclusively, at least as far as settling the fight goes, whereas if there were two armies in the middle on each side, the middle ground would then be a little bit more important, especially if there was more cavalry involved as well. But as far as the actual map goes, I really like it, so good job to Vision, and thank you to Aethad for sending this one to me. Next, again, like I say, I'm not really sure with regards to my schedule about what I'm going to be releasing when. It's a little bit all over the place, to be fair, but regardless, I do still have a few more. I've got one Mountain Pass fight coming up. I also have a fight on Caer Andros, WK's version of Caer Andros, coming up as well, and I do hope to be in some .97 fights in the near future. Again, finding the time to produce content at the rate that I do and actually being in the game it's more difficult than I would like. Again, I could sort of step back on the content a little bit and maybe release one video every 3 days, and that might sort of make it so that I can be in a few more. But I mean, we'll see. We'll play it by ear. It's not something which necessarily has to be held to, you know, concretely, but we'll see. Regardless, I hope you enjoyed this, because I certainly did. Custom scenarios are always a lot of fun to watch, and I hope you will join me for whatever is next.